Hello, this is Brian Hodson from Descartes. I'm the VP of Industry Marketing, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on real-time freight visibility success with Steelcase. Just before we get started, a couple of housekeeping details. We will be sending out a copy of the slides and the recording to all the registrants, so that question comes up. And then we do have a session. Everyone's muted on the line, but we do have time at the end. So encourage you to ask questions through the Q&A function on the left of your screen. So as we step through, we'll make sure we allocate time at the end. If we do run out of time and there's extra questions, we'll make sure we follow up individually and get those addressed. So let's get started. So what are we going to cover today? We have a really good panel, so I'll introduce those folks. And I'm really looking forward to a lot of good content in terms of the use cases of visibility. So we'll talk about how visibility can be applied to really drive some business value. And the visibility in the last few years has really become a very hot topic. So we see a lot of demand around companies implementing it to improve their customer service. But there's a number of different other scenarios, and we'll go through those also in terms of thinking about how to build that and leverage value for your company. Then we'll talk about best practices of carrier enablement, really ensuring that there's alignment across the carrier base and across the company to drive, really get that success, get the visibility that's going to result in the success. And then Steelcase will step through how they're using Descartes, a bit of background on their supply chain, where they see freight visibility going. And then we'll wrap it up with key factors, that you should consider. And then, of course, we'll address any questions that come up. So as I mentioned earlier, we have a very strong panel here. First, I'd like to introduce Steve Banker. Steve's technology focus is around transportation management, managed transportation services, warehouse management, supply chain planning. At ARC, he has been covering supply chain technology since 1996. He's one of the best-known industry analysts covering supply chain management and a frequent speaker at industry events. He's been widely quoted in trade publications covering logistics, material handling, supply chain management, and he has his articles published in Supply Chain Management Review. In recognition of his contribution in the supply chain logistics field, Steve was selected as a pro to know by Supply Chain Demand Chain Executive Magazine. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you.
And we also have from Steelcase, we have Keegan McCready. Keegan is a senior project manager and a member of Steelcase's Global Operations Project Management Office. He began his career at Steelcase in 2012 in the logistics group as a project manager focused on transportation and modernization-related activities. Keegan spent time as manager of continuous improvement for logistics, focusing on business process improvement opportunities where freight visibility and MacroPoint was identified. He now leads strategic cross-functional initiatives globally related to various aspects of operations. Keegan is PMP and CSM certified and looks forward to growing Steelcase's operational execution ability through strategic project leadership and team development. Keegan, welcome. Great to have you here.
Thank you.
So I talked a bit earlier. We're going to talk about the visibility use cases and value. So to lead us in this, I'm going to turn it over to Steve. Steve, can you take it from here?
Absolutely. Thank you, Brian. So in talking about use cases, what I'd like to do is tell some stories. And I think the way to introduce this is, when we talk about customer service and we talk about transportation solutions, transportation management systems have been out there for a long time. And when people put a TMS in, they know that they can get payback from reductions in freight spend. They'll also improve their customer service. But many companies struggle to put a return on investment on customer service. They think it's something they should do, but they have a hard time putting a business case around that. But when we talk about supply chain visibility, I think this is something we need to tackle head on. I think for a lot of companies, if they want to put in a visibility solution, they will need to take a stab at putting a dollar number on what an improvement in customer service should be. There's actually a blueprint on how to do this. There was a publication, a classic publication in Supply Chain Management Review a number of years ago, where the head of the North American delivery operations at that point in time at Staples talked about their experience. So what Staples did is they put together a perfect order metric, and it of course included whether shipments were on time or not, but also looked at things like out of stocks and warehouse errors and product handling errors. And basically what Staples did is they took 2 batches of historic orders, and the orders were about the same size. One batch of orders were perfect, and one batch had some sort of problem as far as delivering to a perfect order. And they looked at over time to what extent did existing customers order more if they'd received perfect orders, and they looked at to what extent you lost customers and the cost of customer acquisition. And basically, at the end of the article, they didn't tell us exactly what their numbers were, but it was they were stupefied at what errors cost them around the perfect order metric. And they found they could make very large investments to improve their perfect order because of the huge economic value it brought. So I think that's worth keeping in mind. And that sort of brings me to the first story I want to tell, which is around Dell. I saw it was Jennifer Futch, the VP of Order Experience at Dell, at a supply chain conference back in 2016. And Dell, of course, has a hugely complex supply chain, complex network of sales channels and channel partners and third-party logistics providers and contract manufacturing partners. And over time, this has had a corrosive effect on Dell's order fulfillment performance. Dell, like a lot of large companies, manages customer service with something called the Net Promoter Score. And their Net Promoter Score was going down. And the Net Promoter Score is it's an answer, customer answers to a pretty simple question. And that question is, how likely is it that you would recommend our company to a friend or colleague? And the way it works is you see how you rank in your industry compared to your peers, although they won't tell you what a particular peer's score is. Anyway, when Dell dug into this, what they learned when talking to customers and what they heard over and over was, I just want you to build, ship, and deliver what I ordered when you said you would. And so they put together a project. They had their own definition of a perfect order metric, which included on-time deliveries and percent complete orders and percentage of orders delivered damage-free and orders delivered with accurate documentation. And at Dell, the biggest pain point was around on-time deliveries. And when it came to the perfect order metrics, that's where they were performing the worst. So they started measuring people on on-time deliveries. But, one thing you hear in supply chain management a lot is sometimes metrics deliver the wrong behaviors. And in this case, what happened is their sales guys might be almost absolutely sure that they could deliver an order in 2 weeks. And then they would provide 3 weeks of lead time just to be absolutely sure. And what happened is, you'll notice under my use cases, inventory carrying costs, the amount of inventory they were carrying skyrocketed, their inventory carrying costs skyrocketed, and their net promoter score actually got worse. And I think that's worth mentioning because I'm guessing a lot of folks listening in today are in consumer goods. And you're probably very familiar with Walmart's on time in full. They're finding companies if they ship short, if they ship late, and if they ship early. So what Dell was doing would lead to fines at Walmart. Anyway, what Dell realized they needed to do is they needed to do a complete redo, and they needed visibility, really granular, good freight visibility information, as well as other types of information to allow them to put a continuous improvement process in place. And so if you look at the right-hand side of the slide, visibility is not enough. You actually have to do something with it. In a lot of cases, what you have to do is you have to put into place some sort of Six Sigma process or a lean process. You find out where in the supply chain things are getting hung up. You dig into root causes, and you change processes to fix that. So that's on the shipper side. I really wanted to hit that improving customer service very, very hard. There's other ways to save money. It doesn't have to be a big project. I'm sure Brian will talk about some of those. But I want to contrast that to the situation on the carrier side. On the carrier side, customer service is important, and they can improve revenues by improving customer service. But in many ways, it's an easier business case. I talked to one less than truckload IT project manager who also gave a speech at a supply chain conference, actually within the last year. And he didn't want to be written up. He didn't want to be talked about publicly. But in their case, their freight visibility solution also included business process management logic. So when a driver got to a site, he would have directions do this, and you would have to check it off that you'd done it before you could go to the next step in the process. And at this LTL got full payback on their freight visibility solution within 6 months just by making their drivers mark whether they provided a liftgate service or not. If you're not familiar with what a liftgate service are, it's something that LTLs can charge extra for. When the shipping or receiving address doesn't have a loading dock, you have to do manual loading or unloading, and carriers charge for that. There's a liftgate at the back of certain types of trucks that can raise and lower a shipment by using a hydraulic system. And average fee for liftgate might be $65, but it can run well over $120. So in 6 months, just by providing real-time visibility, by having a mobility solution that their drivers used, by enforcing processes, they were able to pay for that solution with new accessorials. ARC writes about supply chain visibility a lot. And we've written a number of case studies. I'm looking at my time. I know I'm probably making the other speakers a little nervous, so I'm not going to go into each of these case studies. But I will just sort of highlight a few things. First, just a few months ago, Yanni Dewberry, who is the Chief Supply Chain Officer at Land O'Lakes, a big dairy producer, but they do other things as well, spoke. And they put in a real-time visibility solution. And he had some interesting things to say. One thing that I found interesting is he said that 5 to 9 has bled into 9 to 5. And by that, what he means is we go home at night, we order something on Amazon, and we have an expectation around visibility and how things will be delivered. Those expectations are bleeding over into business to business, and visibility is one of the ways that they need to tackle that. The other thing he talked about is there are many shippers. Between the driver shortage and the increases in demand, are having trouble having some of their lanes covered. They've had shipments sit on the dock sometimes for days before they can get delivered. So there's a real push to become a preferred shipper in this kind of environment. Land O'Lakes uses their real-time visibility for that. Historically, what we did is we mainly paid drivers by the miles they drove. And part of the reason for that is before we had good real-time visibility, if it took, if a driver said it took 10 hours, we wouldn't know if he'd stopped at his girlfriend's house for 2 hours. So why should we pay him for 10 hours? But with real-time visibility solutions, and some big shipping companies are starting to say, we'll pay you extra if we can see that you're stuck in traffic. We're going to pay you extra if you sit too long at a facility before we turn you around. And just making life a bit fairer from a transportation driver's point of view than things have historically been. The other conference I was at about a year ago was Descartes Evolution. And one of the divisions of BASF spoke. And I hope you read that article. What BASF did was really interesting. We had 2 speakers from BASF there. And I want to emphasize when it comes to customer service, you need a continuous improvement process. And in this article, what is described is a year-long process they have around improving customer service in conjunction with their 3PL partners, including a freight conference where they bring their leading carriers in, and they brainstorm and they work on how both BASF's customer service can be improved, but also how can BASF improve their carriers' utilization. So good story. Hope you take a look at that. Finally, ARC has written a number of articles about how often freight visibility needs to be combined with real-time manufacturing visibility. So here's a story about our seller, Mattel. They're a big steel manufacturer. Up in Quebec, they have this huge mine for iron ore. They've built their own railroad to their own port, and they figured they invested hugely in being able to ramp up production at their iron ore mine. Well, that did them no good because they didn't have the capacity to take all of that iron ore away. So the combination of really good visibility into what was coming out of the mines and good freight visibility allowed them to improve their transportation capacity and get the return on investment they needed from expanding their facility. At this point, I think I'd like to just hand it back to Brian. Thank you.
Excellent, Steve. Thanks. And again, really good insight with some of those stories. As I said earlier, I think we see customer service as the most dominant sort of business justification. And visibility for many years has been sort of an elusive goal and sometimes hard to justify. But it's good to see, some examples of where it's been justified. We also see other areas. I was speaking to a customer a couple of weeks ago, looking to implement in their case they're a 3PL and they use owner operator to move their freight for their customers, and she basically said, look, it's gone from sort of, in her space, competitive advantage to just customer expectation. The customers are expecting it. They're expecting much more granular visibility. And then to complement that, it was also around, again, with the driver shortage and really trying to be friendly with the carriers, giving the carriers some more information so they can be more sort of part of the team. So they viewed it also as an opportunity for driver retention and recruiting to really make them envelop into the value prop of the customer. And then certainly on the shipper side, you mentioned inbound and manufacturing. Could be improved with dock scheduling. We have another customer I was speaking to who, delivering into large big box retailer, if they missed an appointment for the dock appointment, and they did not give a notification to the retailer, they would actually take 2 or 3 days to get that truck back into the dock. So obviously that causes a lot of extra cost, frustration with the carrier. Whereas with a notification, if they're going to be an hour too late, they got to either get in that day or worst case, within 24 hours. So there's a couple of other examples. Your liftgate example is another sort of special case of we see a fair bit of value around detention and being able to, with real-time visibility, you have a system of record of detention. So it resolves all of the discussion of, well, did they show up? No, they were here. They were in line. They weren't at the right the right dock. They hadn't got into the yard. All those sort of things. It becomes a proof point that can, in some cases, carriers can build a revenue stream on it, but also just provides single record of truth that everyone can look at and drive the success. So now I'm going to talk a bit about best practices in carrier enablement, which again, is a key element of success. Getting compliance, getting the carriers on board. Steve, you talked about being carrier friendly, and sometimes it's perceived by the carriers as sort of Big Brother watching. So that's an important element of it. When in talking to customers and prospects, a lot of discussion comes up with how many carriers, how do you connect to those carriers, what are the best methods. MacroPoint invented the cell phone triangulation, but now that's expanded dramatically across things like ELD, dispatch systems. Some ELDs may not have GPS, so there's a fair bit of discussion on that. However, the underlying points that need to be also considered to really drive that success, things like data quality. That might be coming out of a TMS, appointment times, those sort of things. What carrier technology? I talked about they could have ELD, maybe they don't have GPS. What are the options for the carrier? In today's world, privacy and consent management is critical. That data, the business relationship is between the shipper or the broker, the 3PL, and the carrier, and maintaining that sort of opt-in and making sure that that consent is rigorous and valid. In talking to customers and the team, organizational alignment across is probably one of the biggest things. I'll talk more about that. But there's a fair number of factors beyond sort of, hey, how do you connect, that really, with looking at the experience and thinking about how to enable, all of these elements are key to factor in to drive the maximum onboarding, and then once those carriers are onboarding, compliance to get that visibility. So what we see is breaking it down into sort of 3 areas. I talked about organizational alignment, process and communication, and then connectivity and data quality. And it's a business initiative. It's always driven by a business initiative. It sometimes gets pushed into IT, but thinking about that organizational alignment, across both the provider, Descartes MacroPoint, the shipper, and the carriers, making sure that everyone understands, hey, this is the objective from a business perspective. It's the benefits of it, educating on the benefits of it, having a firm timeline, maybe key metrics in terms of success on those timelines. Driving that organizationally is critical. So let's drill in a bit in terms of what we see in terms of the right teams. On our customer shipper side, key, there are typically at least 3 roles involved, and getting the executive sponsor, providing and communicating out that business value we talked about earlier. It could be around customer service, could be around operational efficiency in the warehouse and the DCs and on the inbound side, but making sure that both internally, not just the IT team and the transportation team, but it may be the customer service team, everyone understands that, and the executive sponsor is key to getting that out, and also getting that out to the carriers. And then leveraging that with the team, a carrier analyst, understanding what carriers are going to be enabled, and that may seem trivial, but certainly sometimes we've gotten lists of carriers where there's also an RFQ going on. Those carriers haven't been selected yet, so that creates confusion. So a clean carrier list, the analyst providing, okay, here's the information, here's the carriers with an accurate set of information, and then someone to drive that. On the carrier side, both starting with the business side and making sure that the business side understands the objectives and the timeline, but also ensuring that information flows through and there's alignment with the IT team. On the Descartes side, we tend to end up working through our carrier success and carrier enablement team a lot with the IT team, connecting into the dispatch system or the ELD or what have you. And if they really have to make, it is much more successful if they're aligned and they've gotten good communication from the business team. And then on the Descartes MacroPoint side, similarly, project manager driving milestones, communicating across all the stakeholders, and then specialists with understanding how each ELD works or each carrier system, or where different connection methods are going to work, what phases and sprints we're going to be implementing the carriers in. So I talked about communication and process. So the initial communication best comes from the shipper. That's where the business relationship is, creating a sense of urgency, understanding milestones and implications of not meeting those milestones, and evangelizing why it's important. Again, Descartes MacroPoint, we have tools that help educate those carriers, but it really gets much smoother, and there's less friction as that's aligned and communicated from the shipper. And then getting the carriers on board, integrating them, doing the testing, validating, deployment, and having metrics in terms of here's our top 20 by volume, get those implemented and quickly, and maximize that adoption and the compliance as quickly as possible, and start and get that payback right away. It doesn't have to be a long project in terms of 3-6 months to get some success. Once some first carriers get out, first wave of larger volume carriers, some success, build on that success and learn from it from a process standpoint, and then adjust and continuously improve. And then we've talked about the connectivity, but and getting that data. So complete carrier lists by volume. So understanding, hey, by enabling this, these first 10, that's going to get 22 or 28% of that volume. Those sort of things. I talked about making sure that the contact info for the IT and the business people is clean, accurate. The consent management, strong data protection is important, especially in today's world. And then, very important is, and again, this does get a lot of attention, so I won't spend a ton of time here. Just a mix of options to connect, and to get the long tail of different carrier types. You may have a large carrier with 200 trucks or what have you, but also owner-operators. You really need a mix of different technology options to make sure that you can maximize and get all those folks connected. And then being able to measure that. So with Descartes MacroPoint, we provide basically automated tools and a portal that everyone can be looking at the same data. So which carriers are onboarded, how many are left, what's the status, and that gets everyone can look at that at any time, real time, to drive the success and identify bottlenecks. So if there's some, if there's a couple of carriers that are not getting onboarded for whatever reason, that can get highlighted and addressed quickly, so it doesn't delay the overall project and the success. So hopefully that gives you some insight and some thoughts to keep track of for successful implementation of Carrier Enable for you. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Keegan, who's going to talk and give background on Steelcase and their project. Keegan?
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. So I'm gonna start with a little bit of background on just Steelcase as a whole, how our logistics industry is set up, how our network is set up, and then I'm going to dive into a little bit more detail on how we use MacroPoint on a daily basis and kind of what successes we've seen with that tool. So I guess to start with, a company as itself, we were founded in 1912 as the metal office furniture company, based in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Not a ton of people know, but our first product was actually a metal waste basket. Back in the day when it was acceptable and social to smoke in the office, obviously fires are an issue in a non-metal waste basket. So our first product that we released to the market was a fire retardant waste basket. Obviously now we're an industry leader in the office furniture industry, focusing on desking and storage and panels and walls and everything like that in the office furniture space. We have divisions in the Americas, EMEA, which is Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and then the Asia Pacific region as well. We're at about 10,000, maybe a little over employees globally, and we closed out $3.1 billion in revenue in fiscal year 18 for last year. So a little bit about our distribution network. We operate what I would consider a relatively complex distribution and logistics and transportation network. It's got multiple facets to it, so I'm going to try to explain it at a high level, and hopefully that will explain kind of how our network works. So we have a whole variety of suppliers that are located across the globe that ship us both raw materials and vended finished good products that we receive via inbound transportation into our manufacturing facilities. I'll go over in a second here where those are all located. But the high level just behind it is we have raw materials coming into our manufacturing facility. Every manufacturing facility has a factory distribution center tied to it. Oftentimes they are located one in the same building, separated by maybe a wall or just separated by bins. That factory distribution center is responsible for, that factory distribution center and the manufacturing facility, I should say, are responsible for very unique type products. So our products are made on a manufacturing facility level in the sense that we have one facility focused on seating, one focused on lateral files, one focused on glass walls, etc. All of that freight leaves a factory distribution center and gets consolidated in what we call regional distribution centers. You'll also hear RDC for short. That's kind of the final leg in the chain before we go outbound to the customer. So our RDCs are accepting freight from a variety of locations, and they're consolidating all of that together for a final customer to go outbound to either a dealership or the final customer job site, depending on what the preference was from the customer. So all the way from suppliers to final mile to the dealer and customer, that's kind of how our distribution network is set up. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on locations and how that looks as well. So we have, I'm going to focus basically strictly on the Americas for purposes of conversation today. So we have 6 manufacturing facilities in the U.S. and then 5 distribution centers, factory distribution centers. We have 3 in Kentwood, Michigan, 1 in Athens, Alabama, 1 in Tijuana, Mexico, and 1 in Reynosa, Mexico. So that is where all of our product is manufactured for the Americas. The reason that there is less FDCs than manufacturing facilities is that Kentwood obviously consolidates through one versus multiple just due to location of where those are located. We have 6 regional distribution centers, or RDCs, Grand Rapids, Michigan, Hazleton, PA, it's just outside of Philadelphia, Atlanta, Dallas, Texas, Ontario, California, and Puyallup, Washington, right outside of Seattle. Those locations are selected based on our customer footprint and volume. So we do an annual modeling exercise that looks at how much freight we're sending to what locations and where is the best location for us to be from a distribution center point of view to operate the lowest total cost from a transportation perspective. and those are the cities that we've selected to support that. And then we have 2 cross-dock facilities. Those primarily support the freight coming and going from the Mexico to the U.S. border. They handle all of the paperwork, compliance, customs regulation activity that we need to do, supporting those 2 distribution centers coming out of those locations. So that's kind of our distribution network. I'll cover our transportation network. We have one Steelcase owned and operated fleet. It's called SC Transport. It's based here out of Grand Rapids, Michigan. Our other regional distribution centers are operated by JB Hunt owned and operated fleets. They're a strategic partnership with Steelcase. They offer localized scale and capacity that we couldn't do from a Steelcase perspective. They still operate big blue trucks. They say Steelcase on the side, but they're JB Hunt owned and operated. In addition to our fleet capacity, which is what we would consider dedicated capacity out of each of those regions, we have 60 plus common carrier partners that we do business with across the U.S. Those typically are a little bit more non-traditional specialized carriers than what you typically see. We have specific requirements that we look for, such as flat floors, 2-foot logistics posts. We want blanket wrap service, and then air ride versus spring ride trailers. We do business with all 60 of those carriers. A lot of them have very local specialties that support certain regions. Some of them do long haul across the U.S. It just kind of depends on the specific carrier and the specific lane. All of our transportation is currently managed in-house. We had a big activity 2 years ago to actually insource all of that activity. We took all of our planning activity that was prior done with a third-party company that we did business with, and we brought that all to Grand Rapids, Michigan. We implemented an SAP TM module, and we do all of that planning activity in-house here in Grand Rapids for the entire network in the U.S. So I'll go into a little bit of detail on MacroPoint and kind of how we use it, what we're seeing, and what we envision the next steps as being. So MacroPoint was driven from a conversation that I had in the business process improvement team. We were looking for real-time freight visibility, to put quite simply. We had experienced some issues on the transportation side with disruption, whether that be due to late shipments, lack of communication from the carrier. The reasons go on, but we were looking for an easier and more efficient way to get real-time updates on our shipments and know where they're at and be able to respond quicker versus calling folks on cell phones or sending emails back and forth trying to solve those issues. So the challenges that we were trying to address is really around efficiency, and that lies on communication between multiple nodes of our logistics network. So when I say nodes, that could be communication from our planning team located here in Grand Rapids to any of the 6 RDCs located elsewhere. It could be to our manufacturing facilities for inbound freight. It could be to the carriers themselves for status updates, those kind of things. And what we were looking for is simply faster response times and ultimately early indication of issues with our shipments so that we can respond quicker and therefore get in front of it with our customers quicker to let them know that we have a plan in place, we're working on it, and we know about it, and that we're not left in the dark. Oftentimes in conversations that I've had with our customers, it's less about whether or not the shipment is late. And don't get me wrong, they still care that the shipment is late. But if I can tell them that the shipment is late before they know about it and what I'm doing about it to recover, there's less of an anxiousness and less of a frustration there if I can approach the conversation with that level of visibility versus, hey, I know it's late, we're going to dig in and figure out what's going on. So the as-is kind of process where we're at today, we have 25 logistics analysts. They're also called planners. They are the ones that are living in it day to day. They're working directly with carriers. They're working directly with our SAP TM system, planning loads to and from various nodes of our network to support our day-to-day run the business operations. The biggest process that we had in the past was called critical tracking process, and that was our homegrown solution on how we thought we would manage late shipments. And we did that via a SharePoint mechanism, and for those of you who are familiar with SharePoint, you understand the frustration in that tool. It didn't work real well all over the board. It was a good way to document what was late. It wasn't a really good way to hold people accountable for what tasks were taking place to resolve these issues, and more importantly, when they were going to be resolved, and then documenting that corrective action so we could reference it at a later date. So all of those current processes and the frustrations that we were dealing with led to this decision on we want to go with the visibility software, which was totally new to Steelcase. At that point in time, we had nothing in the past remotely similar to what we get with MacroPoint today. And so we came into it with some criteria as we were doing our vendor selection to try to narrow down the field for what should we be looking for. And so our criteria was we wanted as close to real-time tracking as possible. We knew we wanted to incorporate weather and traffic because those are probably the two biggest issues we battle from a transportation perspective, especially in certain areas of the country. And we really wanted automated communication, so something that would tell us when something is going wrong, and then a reporting structure similar to what Brian was mentioning on how do we know that we're doing okay on a given week or a given day. And so we went through an entire vendor selection process with our procurement team. We looked at 7 vendors total. We reviewed and ranked them individually against the criteria that I talked about and kind of graded them on their performance, and then ultimately ended up on MacroPoint as a good partnership for Steelcase and what we were looking for on a daily basis. So how do we use the visibility is the biggest question I get. Right now we have all of our fleets running through MacroPoint. And we have our common carriers that are in the middle of onboarding through MacroPoint. Last I checked, we have approximately 85% of our load volume that's running through MacroPoint right now. And right now, I would consider us in the phase of kind of the stragglers for our carrier base. The ones that are left do relatively low volume for us. It's very sporadic. So we're still working on it, but we're not as urgently approaching those ones as we were with some of our higher volume carriers. So how do we use the tool? We use it every single day in a daily startup meeting that we do with our transportation team. We call it our daily touch base. The entire department participates in it. It's a good opportunity to kind of have a gut check once a morning to understand how's our business operating, where are our current issues, and what are we going to do about it. And we use MacroPoint to fuel that discussion based on the control tower view and based on what we know is late or at risk based on what the tool is telling us. So we use that daily in our stand-up. We use it to track action items and what we need to do, and we translate to other accountability methods so that we can take that through to completion. We use MacroPoint for all of our shipment types. So we do it for inbound. We do it for our CST transportation, which is in between an FDC and an RDC. And then we obviously use it outbound to our dealers and customers is the biggest use case for it. We use compliance percentage tracking and corrective actions on a weekly basis. So we get a weekly report that looks at our compliance for the week and kind of what carriers are struggling and which ones aren't. As Brian mentioned, it's incredibly important to have like a carrier analyst on the team when we're onboarding. And so we have one of those that we work almost hand in hand with as compliance measures fluctuate. We can use them as the business relationship owner with our carriers on what do we need to do to solve those issues if there are any, and what help do they need from us to do that. So that's an incredibly important part of the overall process that we have put in place. The most recent thing we've done from a visibility perspective is we've rolled this out not only to our transportation group, but we've started to roll it out to our distribution centers. We've had this belief since we started this visibility journey of we wanted to put this tool in the hands of our distribution centers so that they could understand information before we could provide it to them. So our distribution centers operate hours well outside of the typical 7 in the morning to 5 at night type hours that the office would work here with our planners. And so any visibility I can give them without having the team in Grand Rapids involved is a win, not only from an working hours perspective, but from a time change perspective with regionality. And so we rolled it out to the distribution centers and we trained them on how to use it and what to look for and what certain indicators mean and what kind of questions to ask. And not only is it sped up the amount of time that, or reduce the amount of time that we spend going back and forth with our distribution centers, but it speeds up the response times from a distribution center reaction perspective for labor planning on who they need to pull in and when to respond to recovery type situations at the DC. So that's been a huge win for us. That is still a very new tool, so we're still learning heavily as we go. But we think that there's a huge use case in our distribution network for how to provide visibility to additional folks across the country. Some of the big successes that we've had, I guess the biggest is just the recovery and the response time improvement. I won't go into specific details, but we've had a couple circumstances where we've had trailers that have trucks that have broken down. We've had a couple rollover incidences. The most recent one was 2 weeks ago where we had a driver that was in a rollover accident. There was the driver was, luckily he's okay, but the driver was injured at the time and couldn't make the call to emergency services. We noticed that the truck was not moving and hadn't pinged in an extensive amount of time, so we called the carrier and figured out ahead of time that there was an accident. What did we need to do to respond to it? That allowed us to do two things. One, we wanted to make sure that the driver was okay and that there was no other injuries involved in the accident. But two, it allowed us to reorder that freight early, and so we could go back to the customer and say, yep, this accident happened, but we already have the freight ordered. It's going to be on the next shipment to you, before they even knew that there was a disruption that was taking place. So that was a huge win for Steelcase. Our critical tracking efficiency has gone way up, and I will say we don't even use our SharePoint process anymore because we use MacroPoint to do that for us. So we have views and filters set up on how to use MacroPoint with the different indicators that will mimic what we had with our critical tracking process for our planning team. And now it's one-stop shopping with the tool that we can go to for status updates, actions, and what decisions we need to make on a daily basis. And then the biggest success is kind of related to the distribution piece that I just talked about, in that we piloted it in the RDC to start. We're in the process of rolling that out right now. Everything is going really, really well, and we think that's got a huge future within the distribution network. So what does our future with MacroPoint look like? I think the obvious one is we need to continue to roll that out to our distribution centers, not only in the Americas, but looking at potential use cases globally as well and what that would look like. But predominantly focused on the distribution centers here just due to locality. We want to be able to roll this out to the plant next, and we haven't bridged that gap yet. Similar to the distribution centers on the outbound shipments, I'd love to get this in front of the plants to look at what raw material shipments are coming at them and any potential disruptions there. Arguably just as important as the outbound shipments, as that could cause manufacturing disruptions from a timing perspective. So we're really interested in getting it in front of a manufacturing environment as well and seeing what kind of benefit they can get out of it. We'd like to start pumping the data from MacroPoint into an internal tool we have. So we have an internal tool called WebTrax. It's the one-stop shop for what our dealers use for all things related to their shipments and their orders and how they get status updates on it, and it's a communication tool back and forth between Steelcase and the dealers. Right now, MacroPoint is a totally separate data set that we can share with our dealers from an information perspective, but it's not all in one tool. Right now, internally, we're looking at how could we get the data out of MacroPoint and pipe that into our internal tool of WebTrax to just have that be a seamless interaction between shipment updates and what the dealer's already interacting with on a daily basis to get that kind of holistic experience on what they're looking for. And then the last thing, I called out the Blue Experience. We have a large program that's called the Blue Experience. If you ask any one of our dealers what the Blue Experience means to them, they're referring to the color of our trucks. There's this belief that when a blue truck pulls up with Steelcase on the side that there's less anxiousness, there's less frustration, there's less concern with how that shipment's going to go. And that just comes to the level of visibility and execution that we have with our dedicated fleets. And so we're trying to figure out how to mimic that across the board. So we obviously know with the driver shortage and the carrier capacity issues in the network that it's not feasible to do our entire operation with one giant fleet. We have to use common carriers for what they are. So how do we expand that Blue Experience mentality to other common carriers and in other ways of visibility to our customers? And so then the last thing before I hand it over to Brian, I just wanted to touch on kind of the challenges and lessons learned. So the challenges that we faced, carrier onboarding took a lot longer than we expected. And I'm glad Brian called out kind of the keys to success because we missed it on a couple of those. We did really good on the Steelcase side. We had a PM, we had a sponsor, we had a carrier analyst. We dropped the ball on the carrier side that we did not get the appropriate IT resources on the phone at the right time to have in-depth conversations on how to roll a tool like this out. It was also a learning for Steelcase that we found out along the way that some of our carriers didn't have a really robust IT network or an IT group. And so then it's trying to figure out how we can help and what help they need to support that onboarding that's efficient for both of us. So it took longer than we expected. It's working, but there was definitely some learnings along the way of what could have gone better. We still continue to struggle with compliance. I don't think this is going to go away. I think this is a constant battle. We work with our carriers. We use the data that MacroPoint provides to help facilitate those discussions with metrics. But I think that's something that we're going to fight with the way the industry is trending and the way that our network reacts. But we're working through it on a daily basis as a challenge of how do we make sure that our compliance stays at a reasonable level. And I will say we have a relatively high expectation for compliance within Steelcase. So we have communicated to our carrier base that we expect a 90% compliance rating or above. And if you're below that, even by 1%, we're going to follow up with you and figure out what corrective action we need to get that back. So we know that that's high, and we know that that can be arguably aggressive in some situations, but we think it's incredibly important. Integration method is really important to understand early on. So it was a challenge for us to explain the difference between an EDI connection or a TMS connection and what pros and cons you get with each and trying to bridge that gap. And we found that a lot of carriers were a little confused on the situation. So it was just working through those intricacies on how to onboard. And like I mentioned before, we had a definite lack of carrier expertise on the IT integration piece. Some of our larger carriers were great, had whole IT teams. Some of our smaller carriers, especially the regional ones, sometimes they don't have an IT support group. They outsource it. And so that was a learning, and that was a challenge for us to try to bridge that gap. And then lastly, kind of some lessons learned. So we have found for Steelcase and the carriers that we use that the TMS connection works better than ELD. That has nothing to do with the tool or the connection types. That's just how the business model of Steelcase works. And the business model of the transportation carriers that we use on a daily basis. So we're pushing our carriers more towards a TMS connection based on their models, and so far that seems to be working really well. We found it vitally important to thoroughly explain pros and cons of each connection type to our carriers. And so early on when we're bridging this conversation with MacroPoint and the carrier is we're starting discussions on what are the connection types and what do we find valuable and what do we find are the challenges for each of those connection types. Up front, we didn't spend enough time documenting business processes. Like I said, this was new, so we didn't really know what we were getting into when we got into it. We should have documented business processes a lot more robustly than we did earlier on so that when we started to get that compliance rating up and we started to get carriers onboarded, we would know what actions to take and what run the business processes we needed to support that. We have a formal standard work in place now, but earlier on would have been more beneficial for our use case. And then the last thing I put on here is just a positive. So we had a dedicated resource at MacroPoint that was kind of our partner throughout this entire onboarding, and we still work with him on a almost daily basis. That was 100% vital to the success of our implementation. Without that, I fully believe that we would still be in the middle of onboarding and we would still have a really poor compliance rating. We really leaned on MacroPoint for a lot of support, probably more than we should have, and they were a great partner for Steelcase to help us get through that big hurdle of visibility and how do we go through this implementation. So that's kind of a high level of Steelcase. That's a high level that I went through relatively quickly on how we use MacroPoint and how we find it valuable. I'm going to hand it back over to Brian to wrap us up.
Excellent, Keegan. Thank you very much. That was good. That was really great. And also just, providing, the good, the bad, and the uglies is, I think, helps everybody. So really appreciate that. I mean, certainly a couple things that struck me even since, we first started talking was the expansion and sort of the phased and agile approach you guys took in terms of, focusing outbound, expanding the number of, shipments that you're leveraging visibility for, and then now, starting with the transportation, now rolling it out to the DCs. And then another key that our other customers leverage is taking that data and feeding it back into other existing systems. There may be analytic systems, TMS systems, but you don't have to do all those things before you get the first value. So getting some value and then doing the next phase. So it seems like that approach has worked well for you guys. So really appreciate that. And I just want to do sensitive to the time. I'm going to pass to Steve for a quick sort of cap of the factors to look for in a visibility solution. And then, Steve, if you could do maybe just a couple minutes, because the questions, we've got quite a few questions come in, and want to make sure we have some time to answer those.
Well, thank you, Brian. Yeah, Keegan, that really was excellent. I'm not going to say too much here. We have a supplier selection guide around transportation solutions, including a category on visibility. Here are a few things to look for, but I really do want to pass it back to Brian so that we have time for Keegan to answer a few questions. Brian?
Excellent. Yep, perfect. Okay. So, yeah, here's a question. What type of IT integration service did you implement following the challenges with carrier expertise? Or, maybe, or just, what are the actions you took, Keegan, when you ran into some of those issues?
Yeah, I guess I'll try to answer the question here. So I guess the actions that we took internally was predominantly from a compliance perspective. So when we went out to the carriers and we realized that there was a lack of IT experience on the carrier side, we basically footed the support team to support that. And so we obviously have a much larger IT organization than several of our carriers, and so we did some pre-work to define a couple resources that I could use internally to Steelcase to help support some of that IT infrastructure for a carrier in the event that they did not have the support that they needed. So hopefully that answered the question.
Yep, yeah, I think so. And here's another one that came in. What do you see as the biggest success with MacroPoint thus far?
I'd say the biggest success for us, it comes down to kind of the story I told about visibility. It's the early communication and the often communication to our customers or our carrier base for how to respond to issues and provide resolution in a timely manner. It's no longer a pull system where we would have to kind of pull information from our carrier base on are you late, why are you late, what are you doing about it? And it's gone more to a push system where we get notifications when something gets behind schedule, and then we can start asking questions based on what we know about the load for what the response time looks like. So I'd say it's saved us a ton of time and a ton of efficiency improvements in daily operations.
Very good, thank you. Okay. And can you expand, I'll maybe take a cut at this first, so can you expand on the components of compliance with carriers? So certainly across our customers, there's, getting the carriers enabled and opted in, and again, there are different connection methods, but getting them, connected in to be able to track. And then there's the element of the number of shipments that they have, which one of those are they tracking? And again, that does tie into sort of fairly sophisticated workflow for going back to the consent management and ownership of data, those sort of things. I don't know if Keegan, there's something other than you want to add on. There's obviously things like you can detect with the GPS and real-time tracking in terms of on-time delivery, those sort of things. I'm not sure if there's other elements that you factor in more broadly with with your TM or other solutions that you can leverage from real-time freight visibility.
No, I think you touched on the big ones that we look at right now is pass number one is, are they onboarded? So what's our percent of carriers that are onboarded into the tool? And then pass number two is, of the total number of loads that we tender to a carrier, what's the compliance rating or the percent of loads that they ran successfully through MacroPoint? A future use of what we're looking at would be leveraging MacroPoint for on-time performance. So right now that's done separately in their transportation management system, but we can see a use case for MacroPoint for that in the future.
Okay, good. Looks like we have time maybe for one more question. What are Steelcase's current pinch points within the transportation realm that you're working through?
I think the biggest one is capacity. It's due to driver shortage. It's due to the industry that we're in from an office furniture perspective. We fight carrier capacity on a day-to-day basis, trying to cover loads across the entire network. So visibility helps in the sense of kind of where our shipments are at, but getting the appropriate carriers in the right locations to pull these loads for us is a continuing battle that we're looking for.
Very good. So that brings us to the top of the hour. Again, I want to thank everyone for attending. taking time out of your day, especially for Steve and Keegan for your contributions. A lot of good insights here. If you guys have additional questions or information, certainly feel free to give us Descartes a call at 1-800-419-8495. Extension 202331, or send an email to sales@descartes.com. And again, Keegan and Steve, thanks very much, and thanks everyone for taking the time. Look forward to our next session.
Thank you.